Good afternoon, everyone that's joining us. Thanks for being here today. We're excited to have another edition of the Hunt Institute's Postsecondary Pathways webinar. We'll give folks about 2 more minutes to log on before we get started. So about 2 minutes and then we'll get going. Thank you for those who have joined us so far. We'll give folks about 60 more seconds or so to log on, just as a few remaining audience members come in, but we're excited to have you here with us this December Postsecondary Pathways. All right. Well, thanks again for everyone that's joined us today. Hopefully, you stayed warm and aren't too cold or wet with the rain/snow that's moved across the U.S. These last couple of days. I know it's quite rainy here in the Raleigh-Durham area, but thanks again for joining us for this edition of the Hunt Institute's Post-Secondary Pathways webinar. These webinars are a monthly installment. Each of our content teams at the Hunt Institute host one, and so we're excited to have you here for the higher education's version. My name is Dr. Winn Decker. I'm our Deputy Director of Higher Education, and on behalf of Dr. Madeline Smith, our Director, and Dr. Javed Siddiqui, the Hunt Institute President and CEO, we thank you for being here with us today. I'm excited for this discussion. We're going to talk about how to truly assess post-secondary student success. Before we dive into it, I want to remind folks that closed captioning is available for this webinar. We're also recording it, and it will be available on our YouTube after the close of the event. And we're currently streaming live on Facebook as well. After we finish this call, we'll post on the Hunt Institute's blog page some key takeaways from this webinar and any important resources that might have came up. So feel free to check there for any additional resources after we finish this call. But I want to give us a few framing remarks before I dive in with our excellent resource experts. We know that post-secondary student success is a very broad term, but what truly is success? We know that every year a substantial number of students leave college and don't actually complete their degree. According to National Student Clearinghouse, roughly 26% of the 2019 class did not come back to college the next year. That's a large number of folks that started that don't actually complete a degree. And this, coupled with our decreasing enrollment across the US, particularly coming out of the pandemic, makes us really ask where we're headed with post-secondary access and success. And so I'm excited to dive into this conversation. With us today, we have Dr. LaToya Owens and Dr. Rusty Monhollon. Representative Quentin Williams from Connecticut was supposed to be joining us, but got called into a caucus meeting at the last minute. So we're hoping that he's able to join us sometime today. But with that, let's go ahead and dive into the questions. So Dr. Owens, I want to come to you first. Dr. Owens is a Senior Program Officer of Measurement, Learning, and Evaluation on the Post-Secondary Success Team at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Her work largely focuses on strengthening institutional career placement and student persistent outcomes, as well as institutional effectiveness and strategic planning at minority serving institutions, also known as MSIs. Dr. Owens, thanks for being here today. Can you tell us a little bit about what other metrics for assessment fit in the understanding of today's learners, aside from just general academic performance? So how do you measure post-secondary student success?
Yeah, traditionally, we've seen a few things when we look at measurements of success for institutions that I believe are now being interrogated or reconsidered. And we generally like to use more innovative and definitely equitable measures when looking at institutions. So historically, first we've looked at, especially related to, let's say, state performance measures at institutions, institutional success related to student inputs, meaning institutions who attracted and admitted students with, let's say, the highest test scores, GPAs, et cetera, were seen as more elite and benefited from the status of their students. And were then deemed elite institutions. Along those same lines, institutions that educate high income students who are statistically more likely to end up in higher earning careers have also been deemed more successful or credited with those outcomes. This means that for institutions interested in increasing their profile, they've had to exclude students that don't necessarily fit that profile or those measures. So for mission-driven institutions such as MSIs, HBCUs specifically, this requires sort of mission drift or creep. To be elite would require them to abandon the students that they were founded to serve. But as in the case of performance measures, they're also rewarded for doing so. So recently, and in our work specifically, we've been doing some shifting to focus on the value add of institutions, meaning research that considers how much the institution has done to increase the social mobility outcomes for students, and a shift to disaggregated data, ensuring that institutions are achieving equitable outcomes across the board, meaning we're holding institutions responsible for not just the majority of their students, but maybe the students that exist right in the minority or on the edges of that institution, and making sure that we're crediting them for high outcomes that they're achieving that across the board. And we're seeing data that's more concerned with the outcomes of lower income students. We specifically have an equity focus that targets low income, Black, Latino, and Indigenous students. And so overall, I think we're seeing institutions be held accountable for the success of their most underserved students more. And the veil is being lifted a bit in that way.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Dr. Monhollon, I'll come to you in just a second, but I think I want to ask you a follow-up, Dr. Owens. You mentioned this mission-driven institutions, minority-serving institutions, that MSI is a broad scope. You know, we've got Hispanic-serving institutions, predominantly Black institutions, HBCUs. Knowing how missions are different, what are some ways you've seen institutions tie their success to their individual missions?
Absolutely. I think one way is for sure the students that, well, for some minority serving institutions, they were founded to serve a particular group of students like HBCUs. For others, that designation came much later after the founding, right? So for Hispanic serving institutions and PBIs, they're much different because their student population and demographic can change annually. And so with those institutions, I think we're seeing more of a shift to understand, one, there may be newer population if that designation is new. So research on who their students are, who they're now serving, and then interventions, instituting research-driven or interventions that particularly serve that group of institutions. And that's a bit of a departure for institutions in general, because previously we've looked at interventions or considered them as just successful across the board, right? This is a successful intervention. Now, again, according to disaggregated data, a real understanding of, is this intervention successful among the students that we are targeting, and why or why not? And so more in-depth research of their own in an assessment of their own institutional practices, and some shifting to do just that. If they're a mission-driven institution such as HBCU, they may have honed those practices already because they have been serving this particular demographic of students for quite a while. And so those innovative measures may be coming from within and maybe something they're researching and doubling down on, et cetera.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. As we've discussed, things like performance-based funding and how those tie to student success. I think what you're saying about the mission-driven institutions and how you connect that to the students is really important. So thank you for that perspective. I want to come to you, Dr. Monhollon, and I think we'll bring it from the institution level more up to the state level. Dr. Monhollon is the president and executive director of the South Carolina Commission on Higher Education. So thanks for being here. Can you tell us a little bit about how South Carolina measures post-secondary student success? I think you're muted, Dr. Monhollon.
Thank you. You think we'd learn that by now. Thanks so much, Dr. Decker. It's a pleasure to be here. The Hunt Institute's been a good friend to higher education generally and the CHE specifically. So I'm very honored to be part of this conversation. As I think is probably true in most other states, South Carolina defines post-secondary student success very traditionally based on such measures as retention and completion. These metrics are primarily institutional focus and inform institutional decision-making and funding from the General Assembly. And that's certainly true in our work here at the CHE. Our overall overarching measure of student success is the state's overall educational attainment and is really a focal point of our public agenda for higher education, what we call Ascend 60 by 30. Like other states, we're trying to move our workforce, those aged 24 to 65, to reach 60% of the workforce holding a high quality post-secondary credential. So I guess in one way to think about it, we're measuring that very traditionally. Graduation, retention, the graduation rates of our colleges and universities is probably the best known measure of standard of student success. The standard measure, of course, is 150% of program length, 6 years for 4 years, and within 3 years for 2-year institution. We measure student retention rates, which looks at how many students persist in their studies from first year to sophomore, sophomore to junior, and so on into graduation. I think things like persistence and there are other building blocks are important metrics because when we ask the question, why didn't students persist? I think they give us, they give us the opportunity then to ask those questions and to look at what are the obstacles, what are the impediments that are keeping students from succeeding. And those are opportunities, I think, to maybe look at other measures of student success, such as those that Dr. Owens raised, to measure what students want and what they're looking for from their educational journey. Of course, we measure by employment rates of graduates. That data can be very limited because of access to data and other factors. We can look at scores of graduates, what they earn on employment-related examinations and certification tests, for nursing or other allied health, for example. Another measure that we look at is how many graduates continue their education, whether it's transferring from a 2-year to a 4-year institution or pursuing post-baccalaureate graduate study. And this is a very important measure for our 2-year institutions, as many students transfer to a 4-year university before completing a degree, and thus they don't show up in the count of the 2-year institution's completion. I think, again, it's starting to get at some of those questions that Dr. Owens referred to earlier, thinking more about equity, focused more on the student rather than what kind of measures work best for the students. I think the one thing from our perspective, and I'm not offering this up as an excuse, but measuring some of the more less tangible aspects of student success, whether it's just acquiring new skills, whether it's a student seeking education for the intrinsic value of education. That's much harder for us to capture and measure. So it's probably a big reason why we often rely on these very traditional and very long-standing measures.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I see that Representative Williams joined us, so going to bring him into this conversation in just a minute. But Dr. Monhollon, you mentioned the dichotomy of the 2- and 4-year institutions. And I think something that's unique about South Carolina is that as a coordinating board, both 2- and 4 years sit under you in CHE. And this is, it happens in some states, but like in North Carolina, our community college and 4-year system are separated. And so I wanted to ask you a follow-up about how do you incentivize the 2- and 4-year institutions to work together? Oftentimes it can be competition for students. And so how are you incentivizing them to work together towards that student success?
That's a good question. When I think our approach in most everything we do is seeking to treat higher education, even though we're not like North Carolina, a formal system. We're a system nonetheless, and thus for the overall system, the overall higher education community to be successful, we all have to work together and collaborate. I think it's easier on some issues, some topics than others. I'll just toss out transfer as an example. I think more and more we've come to realize that the transfer of academic credits from one institution to another is so important to student success, especially for those students who are transferring. If we can ensure the seamless transfer of credit where they're not losing credits, or we are able to ensure that the courses they took at one institution transfer as an equivalent and count towards the major, or count towards the degree, I think we're reducing what some call, wasted credits, or courses that only go to elective credit, which reduces time to degree and less cost for the student. So it's in an era too, in a time when there is more competition for students and there are fewer of those traditional age students and more non-traditional students entering the higher ed realm, I think transfer and finding ways to measure student success is going to become increasingly more important, not just for our 2-year institutions, but also for our 4 years. That smooth transfer path, I think, is going to be a really crucial element of a lot of our 4-year universities, as they are, I don't want to say specialized, but they become very adept at helping degree completion students.
Yeah, thank you for that. And, I believe some of the last numbers I saw, somewhere close to 40% of higher education students are no longer the traditional 18 to 24-year-old that articulates right from high school. So between the changing population and the enrollment cliff we're kind of facing in 2027, this quote non-traditional student population is even more critical to our post-secondary education. Awesome.
Absolutely.
Thank you for that. Representative Williams, would love to bring you into this. I know it's incredibly busy time of year for you, so really appreciate you being here. Representative Williams is starts at the 100th district in the Connecticut General Assembly. Really want to ask you a question about being an elected official and working in this space. There's a lot of ambiguity associated with how stakeholders understand and define academic success. How can legislators and higher education institutions come to consensus about understanding and measuring student success? Where have you seen it be successful?
Thank you for that question. I really appreciate you being here, and I apologize for being late. I am also an early education administrator here in Stamford, Connecticut, at a future Blue Ribbon school, which I'm really proud to brag about. I'm already calling that we're going to win it before it even happens. But when the kiddos need us and our scholars need us, I got to help take care of that. So I do apologize. But you asked a great question, and I think it really revolves around the idea of having both the sort of like quantitative and qualitative research, right, and data. That some things we can actually like measure, and we can look at data points and go from the very beginning. And there's also going to have to be stories that are told to better understand where we're going. And I think one of the major issues, and I want to quote one of my favorite leaders, Dr. Greg Boyle, and he says, yes, we can often measure things, but is it actually important? And I share that to say is that we often are looking at collegiate success around one's potential to earn, one's potential to like produce goods and services. And we have missed out of a lot of the other things that I think make us human and make us Americans, right? And make us good citizens. So active engagement in our community, appreciation of the arts, a love for taking care of your neighbor, all those sort of things that are such an important part in process. Teamwork is another a good example. A huge portion of the process of what it means to be a scholar and a student and an academician that you learn in these institutions that we sometimes and oftentimes overvalue because we're so hyper-focused on what is the average salary going to be, how much student debt did you come out with, and all those things that are easy to measure because it's very difficult to measure whether one's participation in an election makes one a good citizen, and did you learn that in college or did you learn it in high school, and so on and so forth. So I do appreciate what we do here in Connecticut is looking at that sort of multi-factor effect, looking at four-year graduation rates, looking at average salaries, listening to the business community about what job openings they have, and figure out how we can route scholarship opportunities and business leaders and reducing student debt to do those sort of things. But then also looking at all the other things that I like to say keep us human.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I guess what I kind of heard out of that is this holistic understanding of what success really is, that there's not just a measure here or a measure there, that it varies based on students, it varies based on what you're trying to accomplish in the state. And so, yeah, do you want to add to that? I saw you on mute.
And for the one quantitative thing that I will point out up front that I am really proud that we've done in Connecticut is we are on the process to having a free community college. So in student debt, which has a huge impact on where you can live, what kind of homes you can buy or not buy, whether you're renting or owning, all those other sort of things. Student debt is one of the clear indicators that will shape that, and being able to eliminate a huge cost for working families. And there's actually no income limit for that policy here in Connecticut. So you could be our most wealthiest or our most poorest and take free community colleges, which will be transformative in many people's lives.
Absolutely. And then coupling that, with the conversation we've heard before about shortening time to degree, making sure that credits really transfer over, all those small pieces. We talk about picking a lot of low-hanging fruit, because once you pick a bunch of them, you've got a basket full, you start to make some substantial change. So really appreciate that perspective. I want to remind the audience, we will do some Q&A. I've got one more question for each of the panelists, and then we'll open it up to audience Q&A. I've already seen someone use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom webinar, but please use that Q&A function and we'll get to questions in just a moment. Dr. Owens, I want to come back to you and start really, I guess, turning our eyes towards the future. What areas of focus have you noticed in terms of the future of post-secondary student achievement? Where do you see that we're headed in defining this achievement and what success is?
For sure, I've seen some shifts to, what I've mentioned earlier, actually understand equitable outcomes, which there's no understanding equity if outcomes are not disaggregated. And then once you begin disaggregating, the metrics that you use and how you're defining groups, et cetera, and subsets also becomes increasingly important. So people requiring disaggregated outcomes, right? And then shifting more towards evidence-based practices in support of diverse learners. Those unique or individual populations is a big shift. I'm seeing more of a shift to the inclusion of student voice or student experience. So students right now have a real platform with social media that has, I believe, forced an increased level of responsiveness and needs or considerations around messaging, especially for underserved student groups. And I think that when we're measuring outcomes and considering how to shape future practices, we're doing more of how is this affecting students directly? What is their experience in this program at this institution? And how do they want to be helped? What are they saying their needs are, et cetera? A shift to focus on campus climate. So what is the learning environment for different types of students, especially as we see more students headed back to school. So non-traditional, quote unquote, students who have been in college before and returning, older adult student learners, students with children, et cetera. What is the environment that we need to provide for everyone on campus to feel included? And then what is the experience of, even of the traditional age students? What is the experience of diverse sets of learners on campus? What have they been, do they feel included here? Are we serving them? Is this a place where those students can thrive or are they even surviving? And we're seeing students who have options moving around to get the experience that they require. You mentioned, enrollment previously. We're not seeing the same enrollment issues at every institutions, right? I mentioned HBCUs previously, and they have actually seen some growth when other institutions have seen some significant declines. And I think that is related to a lot of what we talk about with campus climate for underserved student groups specifically. And of those groups, adult learners specifically, we've seen a shift in institutions trying to support their least targeted learners. So now learning more about what it takes to graduate or recapture non-traditional students. And then of course, focus on student debt and financial security, mainly messaging about what the return on investment is for college, as many students begin to think that, there is no necessarily a financial gain, or there's more of a focus on the debt that you accrue and the terms around that debt, et cetera, than the benefits of attending and graduating.
Yeah, that return on investment conversation continues to, I was going to say loom large, but I think it continues to grow. I think in every place we're going to, there's that question, and we saw some public polling that showed up to 50% of students in their family are asking what the return on investment really is for that higher education degree. For the last piece before I come to you, Dr. Monhollon, Dr. Owens, what you said reminded me of a conversation we were having in Tennessee, and one of the chancellors said we've tried to quit asking our students college ready, and have started asking, is our college ready for students, and making sure that the colleges are owning their portion of making sure that students are successful as well. And so I really appreciate the perspective you bring. Dr. Monhollon, I want to come to you again to, as we're talking about, the Commission on Higher Education. How do you all make policies and directives in a way that allows institutions to be innovative in their battle to improve student outcomes? Oftentimes policy can be restrictive. So how do you create policy that allows institutions to still be innovative in their approaches? I think you're muted one more time. That's all right.
And certainly we don't want to make policy that stifles innovation. But I maybe just kind of twist your question a little bit. I think there is a line between perhaps policy at the state level impeding innovation on campuses, but also state policy driving innovation across the entire education system. In my view, and I alluded to this a little earlier, is what we call the collaborative engagement we have with our office and our colleges and universities in South Carolina. Our institutions have so much talent and expertise that when we're working on an initiative or trying to develop a new policy, certainly we'd be foolish not to tap into that knowledge. So one of our many tools at our disposal is convening people in forums in which they can discuss best practices and innovative work across the system. One institution can share its innovation with others, and hopefully those best practices can be transplanted. But I guess I'm pushing back a little bit because I think some challenges require a systems approach to remedy. And here I think policy plays a key role. I'll come back to transfer, for example. If we want, as I believe we do in South Carolina, a comprehensive and student-centered transfer system, it has to be built on policies and practices that are accepted by all of our colleges and universities in order for it to be effective. So I don't think it's a secret, and I don't think we have any unique claim on this approach, but we don't develop policies in a vacuum, nor do we do it without input from our institutions. Genuine collaboration is how we approach our work, and in my opinion, the only way we can be successful at our work. And I think it's that balance is beginning to produce some results. We're seeing good results in South Carolina in our transfer system. We're beginning to look at some other questions around whether it's college readiness, pathways for students, beginning to look at different types of institutions and how they're able to reach different kinds of students, in particular adult learners.
Yeah, thank you for that, and I appreciate that pushback. It's that balance of the policy, the innovation, and excuse me, getting that buy-in, having the institutional voice engaged in that work. So appreciate what you're doing there. Remind the audience one more time. I see a few questions come in, and so we'll turn those around in just a minute. But I have one final question for Representative Williams before we get to audience Q&A. Representative Williams, it goes back to where you were kind of going with the free two-year community college. Connecticut's doing a lot of work on supporting affordability, but what are some ways, both in Connecticut and more generally, that we can improve the financial aid process for higher education institutions and state government?
Great, another great question. And I'm probably just going to repeat very quickly what I think the other two doctors said. And it's really about starting as early as possible. That dual enrollment in high school is the #1 way to help with college affordability. And it also does one more thing. It almost ensures not a guaranteed, but the rate of graduating in 4 years when you start off with credits is significantly higher than coming out. So if we really want to look at college affordability, it's about how do we prepare our students in the earlier grades. So starting off with college credit in 9th through 12th, then waiting for them to get to the higher education system. That's the #1 priority.
Really appreciate that. I'm actually going to come right back to you because someone dropped in the Q&A, Representative. They asked for you to repeat the list of metrics you referenced in terms of skills that make us human. Can you just go back to that conversation around the skills that make us human that you're talking about measuring success and maybe some of the metrics you mentioned there?
So it may just be because I am a theatrical politician, but I think the arts are a great example, right? Whether it's the ability to play an instrument or to use your vocal voice or to understand theater and all the things that come with the theater experience, being able to understand other people's emotions and how they feel, the confidence of speaking in a public place, empathy, storytelling. There's just so many things that like just theater alone can bring, and we completely undervalue an arts degree in a theater degree, and that also doesn't come with all the like sort of business management parts that come with making a production, right? How do you promote it? How do you get people to your and your audience? How do you set those sort of rules? How do you design your costuming? What's part's theater of the mind? What part is actual theater in front of the stage? All these sort of things are things, and that's just my personal love for what the arts brings. And I truly believe that we would have a very different society if we all had a better understanding and appreciation of art. So I think there's a lot of other things, but I think if we just started off with like arts and communication, and greater valued that, we would track things a little differently or a lot differently.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess what I am hearing is maybe those soft skills. I think we're oftentimes hearing from employers. I think for the longest time we thought coding, engineering, those hard skills that were practical. But now we're hearing from a lot of employers, it's the things like the personal skills, the soft touches, the understanding, group dynamics, those things that aren't necessarily taught per se in a class, but come with those experiences that you're talking about.
And here's a great example where you can take Microsoft, you can take Apple, and you can take Xerox. We still to this day use tons of Apple products. I mean, I'm on a MacBook Air. I had the reminders and calls coming from my iPhone. I'm a Windows person myself. Like all these little things that are day to day. But a lot of those inventions that we're talking about, the personal computer invented by Xerox, there's a lot of the microchips, the Ethernet cord, so that we can actually get on the internet, all invented by Xerox. But we don't talk about Xerox at all. But we talk about the brilliance of Bill Gates, and we talk about Steve Jobs and Apple and all their innovativeness. And if we didn't look at it necessarily as like a business skill, right, but looked at it as a problem-solving skill, which is what the other two leaders did by blatantly stealing from this other major corporation. If we just reframed how we look at problem solving, I think we would come up with different solutions.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And, one of the things, I'm going to move us along, but one of the things that I think we've heard recently is there's been so much about innovation in higher education. And then maybe it's time to scale our way out of some of our issues and not necessarily come up with the newest, latest craze that a lot of people are doing a lot of great things. And how do we better implement those and scale them versus trying to come up with, a golden arrow that's going to fix all the problems in higher ed. Dr. Owens, I'm going to bring a question to you about remedial and developmental education, but I want to come to Dr. Monhollon first because there was a question put in the chat about non-degree credentials and do they count for degree completion in 2- and 4-year institutions in South Carolina. And maybe I want to expand this just a little bit to more broadly the Ascend 60/30. So can you maybe just a couple of notes about Ascend 60/30 and then how non-degree credentials fit in that?
I'm 3 for 3 on that. So yeah, Ascend 60/30, what we want to do is to get to 60% of our population, our working age population, holding a high value or a high quality credential. And what that means is could be an associate degree, it could be a baccalaureate degree, but it could also be a short-term certificate or certification that can lead directly to employment. Certified nurse's assistant, for example, is a good example of that. So the answer is yes, we do count those in our numbers when we talk about our overall educational attainment. What isn't counted are those that are not programs that bear some kind of credit or certification that don't show up in the data and the reporting. And it's probably another area where we need to think again about how we measure success, and are there ways that we might be able to capture some of that, because I would see a student who even takes a course that might help them professionally. There's a real value in that, and we're right now not able to capture that, even though that particular student saw success that they were seeking.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And, we've had some conversations both with you when we've been in South Carolina and then other places, but what does this next iteration of attainment goals look like? As we've measured success to get, 60% of the population to the workforce degree or credential, does the next iteration tie that to specific, workforces that are in states? What does that next iteration look like? So excited to continue to watch y'all's work in South Carolina. Dr. Owens, I want to bring this question about developmental education to you in the sense of, we're seeing them, particularly remedial education, we're seeing move out of college, the college coursework. Same for developmental education. How do we counteract this when there might be some students that need these experiences to get where they need to be in post-secondary education? So how are we moving forward without the developmental education kind of in the curriculum?
I think that I'm seeing institutions do a few different things, and I don't know if it's always getting rid of developmental education per se. I think we've always had some naming differences in terms of how institutions name or what they deem their approach to serving students that are coming from K-12 context where they were underserved and are deemed, right, not as prepared for college as maybe other students in their institution. And so how do they transition them into institutions? I think that some institutions are being responsive to their own institutional data that showed they were not being successful transitioning students out of developmental education. So they were accepting them to these programs, and they were either staying in these programs and building significant debt because they were paying tuition but not achieving or earning the credits they needed, or and repeating these courses, et cetera. So I think a lot of institutions said we have to do something about this and find other ways to be successful, et cetera, and especially being responsive to educational debt that's becoming an increasing concern. I've seen some institutions move supports into general education classrooms, meaning they identify courses that students need to be successful. And I think that we're seeing a lot of, right now, innovation in them trying different approaches. What does it mean to have wraparound services for certain subsets of students as they are integrated into the normal or traditional classroom, and then assessing success with that. So maybe looking at institutions and students and disaggregating their outcomes and saying, okay, where's the threshold for students who were successful in this course, who made an A or B, et cetera, and what are the similarities and differences? Then what do we do with the group of students who still weren't successful when we put them in that traditional classroom, even with these supports? And so I think on the one end, you see it disappearing because it had been something that the institutions had done for a while, but they hadn't necessarily taken an assessment of their own, right, an audit of their own practices of their own courses. And when they did, they saw that some change needed to happen. I don't know that every institution has settled on what the next step is. And then I think for some institutions, there's still those more traditional summer programs, et cetera, but they never labeled it developmental education, likely because it was applicable to such a large portion of their student body. And they saw that those supports were needed for so many students.
Yeah, thank you for that. The tying together the support services with the coursework, with the classes, that continuing to break down some of those barriers, where a student might have to go to the class and then go all the way across campus to the tutoring center or something to get that additional support. Starting to streamline that and add it together in the curriculum and in our engagement with students is incredibly important. I think we've got time for one more question for each person. So Representative Williams, I'll bring you one and come back to you, Dr. Monhollon, and we'll close it out with you, Dr. Owens. But question for you, Representative Williams. I'm going to kind of do it twofold because we've had two questions that I think make sense for you. One is about how economic mobility fits in this conversation. How do we measure, do we think of economic mobility as a success story? And then I also want to bring this conversation about students that are differently abled, students with different abilities. How are we measuring success for this group of students as well? So I know that's two completely separate questions, but I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on both aspects of that.
Once again, also two great questions and questions that are really at the heart of a lot of issues and actually at the heart of like my personal story. So I was someone that was diagnosed with ADHD wicked late. And for those that don't know, I recently changed my last name, changed it in February, and took my mother's last name, who was a single mother who raised me in a small apartment complex in the south side of my hometown where I represent. So that idea of what it takes to be able to get out of the housing complex that we lived in, and now to have her owning her own home and myself owning our own home, is something that I think about all this sort of what I like to call strategic luck that it took to get there. Her union job, the education that I got, but I really both at the early education, but also at the higher education level at Bryan University. And it is a privilege to not have to worry about that. So I appreciate my mom in particular saying that she was only going to like study. I can only study something that you knew what job can come out of it. So like in accounting, if you study accounting, you can go be an accountant, right? If you study management, you can go manage something. But something I wanted to study political science, but that was not in our books because we had to be so hyper focused on that return on investment in college. So I think about it all the time, and especially comes around to the idea of, okay, well, anyone could just start their business. Like if you could start it out of your garage. Well, we didn't have a garage. Where we parked was all the way down the hill, all the way down the street, and it was a 3-minute walk. So no, I can't start a business out there. So we do have to think about the return on investment because it has such an impact. If you come out with tons of student loans on where you can live, how do you get to work, if you can start a family or not, so many other things. So we do have to focus on that. And I think we have to look at our entire educational system from the very beginning to recognize that we did not design it for it to work for everyone. The system was not designed for students of color to do well in because they weren't in it when we first designed it. It wasn't designed for women. It wasn't designed for any of us that are neuroatypical. It wasn't designed for those with poverty needs. The list goes on and on and on about who it was not designed for. So we do have to have some real major reframing beyond an IEP process. We really have to think about it in terms of what does success look like? Even the idea of like like this graduation rate around 4 years. Is that the right model to look at in 2022? Yes, it worked really well. If you were going to take over your family business and you already knew what it was going to come out with, maybe that's not the right way to do it anymore. And we have to start to reframe that and relook at it and looking at these systems based off of individual needs and not just system needs.
Yeah, thank you for that. And IEPs, just for those, I know we've got, that's more of a K-12 early childhood term. I know we have some post-secondary folks on here. So IEPs are individualized education programs. These are legal documents that are really setting up what a school child needs in a public school to make sure they're getting the support services they need to be successful. So just wanted to name what an IEP was before we moved on as well. Dr. Monhollon, I want to come to you because one of our attendees asked about, you touched on transfer some, and they're curious what some of the solutions South Carolina is exploring. In North Carolina, one of our main problems, and they name it, is this idea of student data systems don't really connect across each other. It's difficult for us to track if a student transfer is successful because our data is not streamlined. And so what is South Carolina seeing as successful, and what are some other solutions you're exploring?
I would hesitate to say that we're successful because we're right in the middle of trying to build this system right now. What we've done for the past year or so, we've had a task force that's really come together and tried to develop a kind of a philosophical framework about what transfer is, how it should work, identify best practices, the kinds of policies and procedures that all institutions should adhere to and follow in order to benefit the student. The next step, I believe, once we kind of have that all in place and can get the institutions on board and they've agreed that we're going to adhere to these standards and these policies and procedures. To me, it's less of an issue with your student data system and more a question of, can you articulate the individual courses that the students are trying to transfer from one institution to another? And I think that's where transfer really gets hung up is that there are some institutions who still insist that they are the only ones that can teach certain courses. And some of them, I understand maybe at, an upper division level, that certainly makes sense in the major. But when we're talking about general education, the kind of courses that really all institutions teach, intro to history, English composition, an intro to mathematics, the sciences, and so forth. Those are the kinds of courses I think that all institutions, for the most part, do well, and there should be little reason that I'm aware that those courses shouldn't and can't transfer as an equivalent from one institution to another. Before I came to South Carolina, I worked in Missouri, and we were able to put together a statewide general education core that included a wide range of general education courses, and it allowed students who completed them at a community college or at one 4-year and transferred to another to move those courses with the knowledge that they would fulfill major requirements and also work towards, count towards the completion of their degree. It's when we can complete that, mesh those courses up and articulate them one-to-one. That's where the real power, I think, of transfer system rests.
Yeah, thank you for that. One of the things we've seen in North Carolina most recently, we did a common course numbering, but we've still got some work to actually implement that to help students understand what that means. And so, like you said, it's a continual process, making an articulation agreement and then stopping there doesn't continue to keep the ball moving. So continuing to implement these types of things and acknowledging that it's, the system is constantly changing in the sense of as we're working through it. Yeah, Dr. Monhollon?
Well, it doesn't end. I mean, you just don't, develop a transfer system and that's it. It requires constant nurturing and updating and tending to. So, what you're pointing to, those are important steps, and those are steps we have to take in South Carolina. But, once we kind of wind things up and it starts running, we've got to be there to keep it running and keep it functioning as it should on behalf of students.
Absolutely. I appreciate that. This has been a great conversation. I've got one more question I'm going to bring to you, Dr. Owens, and then we'll wrap this thing up. But the Gates Foundation, you get to see a lot of different ideas, what different institutions, what different nonprofits are doing in their work. And Dr. Khan asked us about what are some of the percolating ideas out there about post-secondary pathways for students. So I just wanted to bring it to you as you get to see a unique set of institutions and nonprofits that are doing this work. What are some ideas you've seen out there that have been successful? Maybe what are some things you're excited to see happen over the next couple of months and years?
Well, this may be a boring answer to this question because, sometimes innovative is not like sparkly and brand new, but really digging into things that have been successful for a long period of time, but haven't warranted or gotten the attention they deserve, and those types of things being replicated. But in terms of approach to pathways, I think just one of the most exciting things I've seen in terms of institutions taking a look at themselves has been like student journey mapping. So an institution putting themselves in the place of a student, saying, as I go through this journey, if I'm this type of student, what are the obstacles I would face at this particular institution? And then as an institution, how can we eliminate as many unnecessary obstacles as possible for each student in their experience? And you have to do that starting from the perspective of the most non-traditional or the most underserved student at your institution, right? And go through that journey for each of them. And they're, coming up with some really, just things that you wouldn't notice that have to do with where a student has to go on campus to get certain types of supports and how you find out about these things, and understanding that some things are hidden or mysterious to students when they really need them to be open and accessible. Also, digging deep on just learning from institutions that really know their student base very well so that they can be responsive. I mean, some of the practices that you see that are even successful in a K-12 atmosphere, right? Schools are more successful when everyone knows the principal, when the principal is very active in the institution, et cetera. That can be the same on college campuses, that administrators are really integrated into the campus community and have direct contact with students consistently. And then just practices that have been, you know, they're not sparkly and pretty, but they're people doing the work. How often or what are the relationships being developed between students and faculty and staff, et cetera? How do we make very basic things like internships, et cetera, accessible to as many students as possible? And some of the impediments that you see, you know, that students need to be eliminated are simply things like transportation. I saw an institution that said, hey, our internship experiences went up when we, one, connected with the local business community, right? And they had a thriving health services community in that area, but then two, provided a busing system that took the students every day. They simply did not have access to these experiences, and the institution was able to do that. So they provided it, and then their outcomes, shot up significantly in that area. So I think it's just digging deep and then grabbing at some of the low-hanging fruit that you can provide to students, but it's very institutional specific.
Yeah, this is great. And having the institutions engage in that, because students oftentimes don't know what they don't know. And so they don't necessarily know what questions to ask. So that mapping, that's great. All of this has been thoroughly informative conversation. I want to say thank you again, Dr. Monhollon, Dr. Owens, Representative Williams, for giving your time to this discussion today. Thanks to our audience who came out and submitted questions. We really appreciate it. Your questions help us think through where we're headed with our webinars. And I want to name that this is the last Hunt Institute webinar of 2022. We will be back in 2023. And I think it's a great conversation around supporting transfer students. We know that this is a topic that's important to folks. It came up a lot in today's conversation. It's coming up across the country. And so we're going to dive deeper into that on Thursday, January 19th in 2023. But thank you, everyone that continues to support us on these post-secondary pathway webinars for coming out. We hope they're informative. Like I said, key takeaways will be on our blog. It's available on this recording is available on Facebook and will be available on YouTube shortly. But thanks again to our panelists. I hope everyone has happy holidays and safe travel if you're headed out of town or even around town. And we'll see you in the new year. Thanks again.